William James corresponded with everyone. His letters run to multiple volumes: letters to Henry, the novelist brother whose fame eventually surpassed his own; letters to Charles Sanders Peirce, the brilliant and difficult philosopher who had given him the seed of pragmatism; letters to Josiah Royce, the colleague with whom he disagreed about almost everything and remained close friends for 30 years; letters to Shadworth Hodgson, to F. H. Bradley, to Henri Bergson; letters to students, to former patients, to strangers who had written to him about the varieties of religious experience with their own testimonies of conversion and mystical experience. He answered them all. He was the most faithfully correspondent major philosopher in the Western tradition, which is saying something in an era when intellectual life was conducted largely by post. This fact about James is not incidental to his philosophy. It is, in some sense, its practice. Because running through everything James wrote, the psychology, the philosophy, the popular lectures, is a persistent, not always fully articulated conviction that the fundamental unit of human reality is not the isolated self but the self in relation. That consciousness, which he described as always personal, was never ultimately private. That the need to be seen, to be recognized, to have one's experience confirmed by another consciousness, was not a weakness or a social nicety but something closer to a metaphysical requirement. James did not write a systematic philosophy of love or friendship, the way he wrote systematic accounts of habit or consciousness. His treatment of these themes is scattered, embedded in letters and lectures and occasional essays, traceable through the contours of his biography rather than the argument of a single text. But the themes are consistent enough to constitute a view, a Jamesian psychology of human connection that is, in its way, as original and as practically useful as anything else he produced. Begin with what might be called the psychology of recognition. James was deeply attentive to the specific damage done by invisibility, by the experience of moving through a social world in which no one truly sees you. He wrote, in a passage from his chapter on the social self and the principles, that there is no more fiendish punishment that could be devised than to be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by all the members thereof. Not persecuted, not attacked, simply unnoticed. James understood that the self, which he defined as the sum total of all that a man can call his, required external recognition to be fully realized. The private self is always in some sense incomplete. It becomes fully actual, fully alive, in the encounter with another consciousness that acknowledges it. This is not a vanity or a weakness. It is, James believed, a structural feature of the kind of beings we are. We are social animals in a deeper sense than the merely behavioral, not just animals who happen to live in groups for adaptive reasons, but animals whose very selfhood is partially constituted by the social mirror. The philosophical tradition tends to treat the self as prior to its social relations, as something that first exists and then encounters others. James's psychology suggested something closer to the reverse, that the self comes into existence through the encounter with others, that without the recognizing gaze of at least one genuine other, the self remains underdeveloped, isolated in a solipsistic hall of mirrors. His own friendships bear this out. James's relationship with Peirce was a sustained attempt to recognize a genius that the academic world was systematically failing to see. Peirce was difficult, financially irresponsible, professionally unreliable, and arguably the greatest American philosopher of his generation. James spent decades arranging lectures, soliciting funds, editing manuscripts, and writing to anyone who might help, not from pity but from the conviction that Peirce's thought mattered and that the failure to recognize it was a kind of collective moral failure. The act of recognition was, for James, an ethical act, one of the most important an intellectual could perform. With his brother Henry, the relationship was more complicated and more intimate. The two men were so different in temperament, aesthetic, and mode of attention that their proximity felt sometimes more like the attraction of opposites than genuine understanding. William was extrovert, immediate, politically engaged. Henry was interior, formal, aesthetically precise. William's prose was famous for its vitality and directness. Henry's prose, particularly in the late period, was famous for exactly the opposite qualities. William once told Henry, with the characteristic tactlessness of affection, that he wished his brother would write a novel as straightforwardly as he himself wrote an essay. Henry replied, with the characteristic precision of his own kind of love, that they were doing the same thing in different registers. The relationship survived all of this because underneath the differences was the thing James most valued: two people who genuinely saw each other, who took each other's experience seriously, who were honestly interested in what the other had found on their very different journeys through the world. For James, this genuine interest in another person, not performed interest, not strategic attention, not the surface-level curiosity that consists of asking the right questions to seem engaged while remaining fundamentally focused on oneself, was the foundation of love in its fullest sense. Love was not primarily an emotional state, a warm feeling in the chest. It was a mode of attention, the willingness to actually see the other person, to allow their reality to make a claim on you, to let their experience matter not as an extension of your own but on its own terms. This distinction between genuine and performed attention is, if anything, more urgent now than in James's time. The social technologies of the 21st century have made the performance of connection extraordinarily easy and the reality of connection increasingly rare. We have more ways to be visible to more people than any human generation in history, and more people report feeling profoundly unseen, profoundly unrecognized, profoundly alone. James would not have been surprised. He would have recognized the phenomenon immediately, the difference between existing as an image in many people's peripheral vision and existing as a presence in a single person's full attention. The latter is what the self requires. The former, in whatever quantity, cannot substitute for it. His ethics of friendship followed directly from this psychology. You owe to the people close to you not approval, not agreement, not comfort, though these have their place, but genuine attention. The effort to actually understand what they experience, what they value, what they are trying to do, what they find difficult. This sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the hardest things human beings do. Our minds are structured to project, to assume that others feel what we would feel in their situation, to interpret their experiences through the lens of our own. The work of genuine attention is the work of suspending that projection long enough to actually hear what the other person is saying, to take it in on its own terms, to let yourself be surprised and instructed by the fact that someone else's inner world is irreducibly different from yours. James thought that this kind of genuine mutual recognition, two people each trying to truly see the other, each allowing the other's experience to matter, was one of the most valuable things human beings were capable of. It was, in its way, the interpersonal equivalent of his pragmatism, the willingness to let reality instruct you, to hold your theories loosely, to be changed by what you find rather than fitting what you find into the theory you already have. Applied to the people in your life, this willingness is the substance of love. Applied to yourself, it is the beginning of wisdom. And applied to the world, James believed, it was the foundation of everything worth calling civilization. Subscribe to the Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.